Couldn't the appearances of Jesus after his crucifixion have been hallucinations?
This has been suggested by a number of critics, but I think there are some insuperable problems with the hallucination hypothesis. Number one, the wide variety of the locations, the circumstances, and the witnesses to these appearances belie the hallucination hypothesis. Jesus was not just seen on one occasion, but on many occasions. Not just by one individual, but by many persons. Not just by single persons, but by actual groups of people. Not at one locale and circumstance, but at many different places and under many different circumstances. And this wide variety of circumstances, people, locale, and so forth, I think simply makes the hallucination hypothesis quite improbable. A second problem with the hallucination hypothesis is that I think we have good grounds for affirming the historical credibility of the gospel accounts of these appearances. And these appearances were clearly physical and bodily appearances. I do not think that you can dismiss this element of the narrative as being merely legendary, because it is unanimous throughout the narratives, it's consistent, and also the date of the Gospels is too close to the time of the events recorded to have allowed such a total corruption of non-physical appearances into this consistent and unanimous tradition of physical appearances. So the very physicality of the resurrection appearances, I think, undercuts the hallucination hypothesis. A third problem with the hallucination theory is that I do not think it accounts for why the disciples came to proclaim the resurrection of Jesus. You see, the Jewish concept of resurrection differed from the resurrection of Jesus in that the Jewish conception was always a resurrection after the end of the world, at the end of history, and it was always a general resurrection of all the people, never of an isolated individual. But in Jesus' case, you had the resurrection of an isolated individual within history, something which was simply unknown in Judaism. The Jewish frame of thought had another category which would have nicely explained hallucinations if the disciples had had them, namely the notion of assumption into heaven or translation into heaven. Certain Old Testament figures such as Enoch and Elijah did not physically die, but were assumed directly into heaven. And this category could be applied to recently deceased persons as well as living ones. So that had the disciples seen hallucinations of Jesus, they would have seen hallucinations of Jesus glorified in Abram's bosom or in paradise. This is where the souls of the righteous dead went to be with God when they died. And seeing hallucinations of Jesus glorified like this would at most have led the disciples to proclaim the assumption or the translation of Jesus into heaven, not his resurrection from the dead, which went decisively contrary to Jewish thinking in at least two fundamental respects. And finally, number four, the hallucination hypothesis says nothing to explain the fact of the empty tomb. You have to conjoin some additional independent hypothesis to the hallucination theory in order to explain the empty tomb. But the single hypothesis of Jesus' resurrection from the dead explains both the appearances and the empty tomb, and therefore has greater explanatory scope and simplicity, and is therefore the preferred explanation. And therefore, for reasons such as these, I think that the hallucination hypothesis is not the best explanation of the evidence.
Do other New Testament writers provide confirming or conflicting evidence to that of the evangelists?
I think that the writings of the evangelists are confirmed by what we have in what is sometimes called the fifth gospel, namely the writings of the Apostle Paul. Paul was a Pharisee, Saul of Tarsus, who was involved in the persecution of the early church, and in an incredible turnaround, he became a Christian because he claimed to have seen an appearance of the risen Jesus. And this turned this man's life upside down. From a Pharisee and persecutor of the early church, he became an ardent Christian missionary who entered into a life of incredible hardship, suffering, and labor, and ultimately made the final sacrifice when he was martyred for his faith in Rome. And Paul hands down to us certain crucial pieces of information, very early traditions about the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, some of the earliest material concerning the resurrection is delivered by Paul in the first letter that he wrote to the church in Corinth, in the 15th chapter of his letter to the Corinthians. He cites there a tradition which he says he himself received and then handed on to the Corinthian church. And the words here are the technical rabbinical terms for the transmission of Jewish tradition. And the saying that follows this introduction is then a very stylized and non-Pauline tradition in which Paul says Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. And then after that, Paul goes on to continue piling up other eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus, including an appearance to some 500 people, most of whom Paul says are still alive at the time of his writing, around AD 55, though he says some have died. Paul is saying, in effect, the witnesses are still alive. They're still there to be questioned, even though Paul knew that some had passed away in the meantime. So this information that Paul gives us about the resurrection appearances, I think, is very important because it refers to some of the same appearances that we have mentioned in the Gospels, particularly the appearance to the 12 disciples, which is also related in Luke and John, and provides an early, incontrovertible attestation to the historicity of those appearances so that these cannot be written off as later legends that the evangelists eventually committed to writing. I also think that Paul's information furnishes good grounds for belief in the empty tomb as well. Paul's letters are what might be called accidental letters, in the sense that he's not writing systematic theological treatises, nor is he writing a history or a life of Jesus. They're not gospels. The letters are accidental in the sense that they respond to various particular situations and questions and problems in the churches that he pastored. And so he doesn't have occasion to specifically mention the empty tomb as such, but I think that Paul implies the empty tomb in a couple of the things that he says. In this tradition that he cites in 1 Corinthians 15, the phrase, "he was buried," followed by the phrase, "and he was raised," implies an empty grave. No first century Jew, and particularly Pharisee, could have thought otherwise. The idea that a man was buried and then raised by God from the dead, but that his corpse still lay in the tomb, would have been an impossible contradiction for a first century Jew. For a first century Jew, there was simply no difference in meaning between a resurrection and a physical grave emptying resurrection. So that in citing these chronological events, he was executed, he was crucified, he was buried, he was raised, he appeared, Paul in effect implies an empty tomb. This is confirmed, I think, when you compare the 4 lines of this tradition to the preaching in the book of Acts, the early apostolic sermons, and when you compare it to the narratives in the Gospels. What you find is that this 4-line tradition handed on by Paul is in effect an outline of the early apostolic preaching. And when you compare it to the preaching in the book of Acts, these early apostolic sermons, the first line corresponds to the event of the crucifixion. The second line, "he was buried," corresponds to Jesus' being laid in the tomb. The third line, "and he was raised," corresponds to the empty tomb narrative. So that I think that this is a summary of the story of the empty tomb. And Paul knew the traditions surrounding the material that he delivered. We know this, for example, from the information he gives about the Lord's Supper, where he speaks of how he passed on to the Corinthians what he received about the Lord on the night that he was betrayed, took bread, etc. And in that story, Paul mentions that this was the night Jesus was betrayed. Well, now, the betrayal story is not part of the Last Supper story. That is part of its context. In mentioning the betrayal, Paul shows us that he knows not just the isolated event, but he knows the context of the traditions that he delivered. And therefore,